Welcome to the PDIA in Action event series. My name is Salimah Samji, and I am the Director of Building State Capability at the Harvard Center for International Development. I will be your moderator today. The format of today's session is as follows. I will begin with an overview of this event series, followed by a presentation before we open to a Q&A session. Matt Andrews and I co-teach MLD 103M. It is a field lab class where students learn to use the PDIA approach by working on real-world public problems. They learn by doing. The students work together in teams on real-world problems with an authorizer who gives them the problem. We asked the alumni of our Implementing Public Policy Executive Program to nominate problems for our students. Over a 7-week period between January and March 2021, our students worked with their authorizer or client to better understand the problem and to identify some entry points. This event series showcases the learning of our students as well as our executive program alumni. Our topic for today's session is reparations in Asheville, North Carolina. And with us, we have the student team, Bethany Dill, Kerianne DiBattista, Isabel Fontanot, and our IPP alum, Keith Young, who is a former Asheville City Councilor. Welcome. I'd now like to invite Carrie to get us started. Carrie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Salimah. As she mentioned, my name is Kerianne DiBattista. I'm a first-year student at the Harvard Kennedy School, getting my master's. With me today is Bethany Dill, who's a graduate school of education student, a master's in education student. And as Salimah said, we're here to talk about our work in reparations in Asheville, North Carolina. This was the problem that day one in our class we were given. So in July 2020, the Asheville City Council unanimously passed a reparations resolution. This was at the height of the wave of Black Lives Matter protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. And the author of the resolution is Keith Young, who is the former city council member and our authorizer for this problem. And the problem statement we were given on day one is a blended component unit the best mechanism to use for a local government to fund reparations? Are there other options? If so, what? So your first question is probably the same one that we had, which is what is a blended component unit and how are we qualified to answer this question? So Keith was nice enough to give us a little bit of a background on what a blended component unit is in terms of it's a way of having financial independence a little bit from a government program. Examples of blended component units are like electricity companies and other utility companies like that. And so we began the process of trying to understand the context of Asheville and the context of the reparations resolution within Asheville and the way that the city government is operating and dealing with this right now by talking to a lot of stakeholders. Bethany.
Thanks, Carrie. One of PDI's unique features is the method and art of problem deconstruction, where instead of moving forward based on our own problem narrative, we recognize that the problem may differ from our initial definition and allow parts of the problem to surface that we might not have seen at first. Problem deconstruction is a way of exploring what are we actually dealing with here. It's a process of opening up a problem to find out what's inside instead of working based from our own assumptions. And this process helps us to move away from oversimplification and toward nuance and questions that take us deeper into the problem, which is exactly what we want in PDIA. Before there are any answers, there are more questions. Through the deconstruction process, we identified 5 main categories of factors contributing to the problem, including social context, internal and external political context, legal obstacles, and logistics. In terms of the social context, there are ongoing divides between Black and white communities in Asheville, with an overwhelmingly white majority population. In practice, racial segregation continues in ways that exacerbate inequity and make mutual understanding and collaboration toward reparations a challenge. Another prominent element of the context that has really heavy bearing on reparations plans is a lack of unity within the Black community itself. And without this organization, there can be a less of a push for reform. This really doesn't reflect how important reform is to the Black community, but seems to suggest a sense of lack of agency and discouragement at historical and longstanding injustice. There's some distrust stemming from urban renewal in particular in Asheville, and we consider too that there may be distrust around reparations. As for external contextual factors, there are limited resources to establish and maintain reparations, especially amid emergency COVID response measures. And there's pressure associated with setting a precedent for the nation on how this process is defined and implemented. The other side of this category is internal, with people setting policy and people leading processes. Part of the problem deconstruction relates to politics. We found a lack of cohesion around reparations, along with gaps in communication and trust among stakeholders. There are also minimal resources available to what's called the Equity and Inclusion Department in Asheville, which will be relevant in reparations, but is not positioned to be a leading actor at the moment in the process. Last, I'll mention the lack of authority and accountability set out for enacting the resolution, disagreement about definitions and next steps, and a new council now with new members than the council that passed the resolution last year. As for legal factors, quickly, various restrictions are at play, including providing direct support for one race not being possible, which raises questions about what kind of legal or financial mechanism might satisfy these restrictions and move the process forward. Finally, obstacles related to logistics are significant too. The purpose of reparations is not unclear, but the way that reparations are to be outlined is unclear. And we've realized through this process that it wasn't clear who was responsible for what and when. And we can move to the next slide, thanks. It's been, first I'll talk about our new problem statement. So after doing this deconstruction process, we rewrote our entire problem statement, and I'd like to share it with you quickly. So instead, first we decided to start with this lack of progress and consensus. So this time, instead of focusing just on the funding mechanism, we stepped back and looked at the whole picture and ended up with this statement. There has been a lack of progress and consensus in designing and implementing, so now accounting for all of these factors, reparations initiatives in Asheville since the passing of the reparations resolution. The slow pace of government has led to small steps that have been mainly symbolic. These steps have signaled to the community that the process has started, but meaningful advancement has been hindered. A concern is that justice delayed is often justice denied, as further delay of this initiative could widen divides in the community and reinforce this existing distrust that came up in our problem deconstruction that the local Black community has in the government. And now I'll outline a few elements of this process of PDIA and how we experienced it in relation to our particular problem. For such a short project, we found that the note that the team begins on seems to set the stage for the rest of the project. Maintaining focus in our weekly meetings and establishing and maintaining accountability from week to week would have been less likely and more difficult if we hadn't approached the first meeting, I think, with our full attention. And we were encouraged by our teaching team to do that. And I think that that was excellent advice and made such a difference in the whole 7-week period, starting the class with the team, with a team constitution that we set up at our first meeting was useful in this way because we decided exactly how we would work together from the beginning. And next, we found that approaching problems with a more flexible and fluid mindset allows for a mental framework around the problem that forms in relation to the problem itself, not just around one definition of the problem that is unchanging or around an unchanging definition of success in solving or narrating the problem. And this challenged our mental archetype by moving ourselves out of the way in the process, focusing on a single dilemma while neglecting options where we could actually move, we found was really unhelpful. And its basis can kind of be in our own pride sometimes than it is in the actual process. So continuing to return to the question over and over helped to keep us in a position of curiosity and this a disposition and readiness to learn. Last, we also appreciated the chance to connect ourselves with thought leaders who are working on similar questions and similar initiatives, and to the value of making connections across people and ideas has been particularly powerful in general. In some cases, those we interviewed connected us to others they thought would be helpful to us. And in other cases, we suggested contacts to them. This was really encouraging to realize that there was no need to work in isolation and that collaboration could move us forward. And I will turn back to Carrie.
Thanks, Bethany. So some of the key lessons that came out of this process, as well as the substantive research that we were doing on the reparations initiative, started with opposition is not the only explanation for lack of movement. So when we first learned about the problem, we saw that there had been very little progress made since July. We were really looking for what is the obstacle, what is the group or the person or the things in the way of this progress. And there is an overt opposition to reparations in Asheville. Everybody is on board with the idea, even if they maybe view what the idea is or the objective is differently. Everybody still wants it to happen. But there's a lot of other reasons why movement hasn't happened yet and is moving forward very slowly, which we outlined in the fishbone diagram. There's a lack of agreement on what reparations should be. There's a lack of agreement on what the objectives should be, how funds should be used, how funds should be distributed. And so looking at all of these other obstacles to explain why things aren't moving forward as fast as anyone would like them to be was a really key lesson learned for us. Working inside out rather than outside in. As I mentioned, the resolution was passed in July 2020. It was a direct response to the national outrage for the murder of George Floyd and others. And so it was really timely, and it was building on the momentum of the moment. And that's very important. And who knows if it would have happened at a different time with a different amount of external pressure. But at the same time, the steps afterwards of building a coalition within the city government, building a coalition of stakeholders who have the same understanding of what this should look like and how to move it forward together, that step was a little bit missing. And so when the council shifted in membership, there was not a central understanding of what this should look like yet. And that's really hindered them because they're still trying to play catch up on what the commitment they made to the community is and how it should be carried forward. This kind of relates to the next lesson learned, which is that the sequencing of action steps for success and momentum is really, really important. Different stakeholders have mentioned to us again that they feel like they're playing catch up in this way, that they didn't really understand the whole breadth and depth of the obstacles in their way of implementing reparations. And so if they could have done some of that beforehand, they had a better idea of how to frame the program that they were putting out, they might have had a little bit more success in gaining key allies in the community and things like that. So we feel like this is also really important for policymakers going forward in the space to make sure that the sequence of the steps of the initiative make sense and that they work to get people on board to a shared vision before moving forward with action. The other key lesson learned, and this is something that came out of our presentations to different stakeholders of our findings, is that there are some really good takeaways from past and present reparation initiatives. It's difficult to say that, you know, the reparations that came after the Holocaust are going to have any bearing on what reparations looks like today, because it was a totally different context. It was a totally different time. And most previous reparations initiatives throughout history have been a response to a single injustice, a very defined group of survivors shortly after the injustice had occurred. And so those key elements of previous reparations initiatives make it a little bit more difficult to translate those lessons to reparations today. But there are still some key takeaways in terms of what reparations could look like. It doesn't have to be monetary. It doesn't have to be just monetary. It could also involve truth telling. It can involve educational initiatives and all these other things. So kind of re-exploring what reparations has looked like previously has given policymakers some different perspectives on what it could be. At the same time, Asheville is one of only a few cities that's moving forward specifically with reparations for the Black community in America. But there are some other emerging examples like Evanston and Providence that are moving forward with similar initiatives. And even from when we started this project in January until now, a lot of progress has been made in those two areas, in those two reparations initiatives. So really looking further at what they're doing and how they're doing it, and how the models that they're using might have transferable aspects, even if not the whole replicable model, copy and paste, has been really useful for policymakers to kind of see them in a different way. A lot of the context of what Evanston and Providence are doing isn't possible in Asheville, so stakeholders were pretty quick to dismiss them as models for learning. But after we kind of explained to them that there were some different elements that might be useful, they were more on board and willing to connect with those people. And we think the connection of thought leaders, again, is really important for progress overall. And so this is where we'll end, which is questions for further learning. And these are the questions that we laid out for the stakeholders in the space in Asheville, along with some ideas of where they might be able to start. So things that we hope that stakeholders in Asheville will think about is how to ensure that the city government and its policies are not perpetuating harm while actively trying to repair harm that's been done, and how to ensure that the Equity and Inclusion Department is able to accomplish its goals. That goes hand in hand with not perpetuating harm. Second, what is the role of the Black community in the city's process, and how can they foster healing and collaboration between the Black community and the city government? Third, how to publicize and normalize the true historical narrative that's going to be elucidated during their first phase of reparations, which is truth telling, and how to foster cohesion and unity within the whole Asheville community around this issue. Fourth, who has the responsibility and authority to act on commission recommendations, and when is this meant to happen? And last is still that original question of legal and funding mechanisms, which we really feel, based on the other obstacles that we've identified, should be coming after all of these other questions are addressed first. So I'll turn it over to you, Salimah.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I'd now like to invite Keith to share some of his learnings of working with our students. Again, as you heard from Kerry, Keith started with like a funding mechanism for reparations, and this is where we landed. So Keith, if you could share, thank you.
Sure, thank you. You know, first off, I want to say it was a pleasure being able to work with the students and, you know, try to explore what the problem was as far as the stagnant movement for reparations in Asheville. 6 months after we passed it, there hadn't been any movement on the project since we passed it. And I think a few weeks before this group convened, there was some tepid movement from the city manager in the city of Asheville to put together short, medium, and long-term goals toward moving the reparations bill forward. I think in my first initial meeting with the group, I laid out what I believe to be the problem of a funding mechanism for reparations. However, I think when you look at, you know, using PDIA to move forward on policy that is really complex. The deconstruction of the problem and rewriting the problem statement was something that this group saw as a meaningful way forward. And I think that was that was pretty interesting to me because, once they came back and said, well, we're not necessarily moving down the path that you suggested. We've seen some other things that need to be addressed first. If I had hair to tear out, I probably would have tore my hair out and said, well, no, this is the main thing that needs to happen. I think you have to always look at the problem and deconstruct it based on what's going on. I think also what happens is when you hear the term of trying to build an airplane and fly it at the same time, this was kind of that same thing. So I think what the students witnessed here was what I consider when politics actually meets policy. Sometimes politics will move policy forward before the policy is actually ready to be passed, because sometimes the window of opportunity just presents itself. And I think what happens is it's kind of like when you have a car and there's something wrong with your car and you take it to the mechanic to diagnose it, but you've kind of self-diagnosed it. Like, yeah, I think I've got an oil leak and I think that's what needs to be fixed. And the mechanic lifts up the hood and goes in there and says, no, you got a whole different problem. Your whole engine is, or your transmission is messed up or whatever. And that's what's causing the oil leak. The oil leak is in response to something else going on in your car. And I think that's what happens with policy a lot of times. I think during last year, during 2020, when we witnessed this civil rights movement around the country based on the movement of what happened with George Floyd that's still being played out right now, it allowed me and some other folks around the country to have political capital to pass things that may not have been quite ready to go. And so at this point, once it's passed and you wonder, what is the stagnation of it? Why is it not moving forward the way it is? The students, they basically saw some common things that I saw, but also enlighten the folks that were on council now, because there's a totally new council. So you've got institutional knowledge of the policy is gone. People who thought it was going to be a certain way are no longer there. And it doesn't matter how well you write a policy, it's only as good as the people left to carry it out. And so they've given the current council and activists in the area an overall view of, some things that are going to need to be attacked, some things that are going to need to be reiterated. And I think it's a good starting point. And so I appreciated the work that the students did. It was very helpful in meeting with them every week. They provided many insights. I think you're only as good as the team of people that you convene. And so everything that, I learned in our executive education course played out here in a real life scenario that will continue to blossom as the iterations continue. And I think what the strongest thing for me is that this is not when you're dealing with complex issues and you're applying PDIA, it's not going to be a one thing fix all solution. There are going to be many things over the course of a policy that need to be addressed in an ongoing manner in order for it to be successful in the long term. And you're going to have to look at that, look at the data, look at what's happening after these iterations, what's happening after policy is implemented, and coming back to it. And that's really the only way that you sustain good policy, is to keep an eye on it. And I think that's what this process has helped the council in Asheville possibly get a start with, but also the community members who are activists who were wondering why there weren't any forward progress for this policy too. I'll digress there and leave room for questions.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'd now like to invite Matt Andrews to say a few words before we open for Q&A. Matt, over to you.
Thanks so much. And thank you to the councilman and to the team for just a really great job. Super interesting. There's a really important lesson from this work, I think, that Keith just covered, which is this observation that the things that you do can run at different speeds. And sometimes we get surprised by that, but I don't know why we're surprised by that, because I think it's much more the norm than the exception. And actually, even in the theory on policy making, if you go back 30, 40 years to some of the people who really did the fundamental work, they spoke about the fact that these, the processes, this isn't one process, it's multiple processes, and those multiple processes work at different paces. John Kingdon had the three streams approach, and in that approach, he spoke about the problem stream, the policy stream, and the politics stream. And he said, these things don't always run in the same way. And really what you're looking for is that moment where they do overlap with each other. And that's what you're trying to do. And that's where your window of opportunity comes in. I think that what he was incorrect about is that sometimes the window of opportunity to act on the politics stream happens before the overlap of the problem and politics sometimes happens before policy is there. And I think that that's what has happened in this case. But what you're really looking for is where those three streams intersect, or those three streams come together. And I think sometimes, two of those streams intersect before the third one gets there, and that's what's happened. I think though that the other part of the story that's interesting is that policy that is new doesn't happen at one time; it happens over time. And that's the thing that makes this very, very difficult. Whether you are in Illinois, whether you are in North Carolina, wherever you may be, you don't develop this kind of new policy in one go. It's going to take time, right? There's a process of socialization. There's a process of building your administrative capability. There's a process of building acceptance around these norms. There's even a process, and I would argue will have to happen, whereby what's happening at the local government impacts what's happening at the state level, impacts what's happening at the federal level, right? And so this is far from over, is the difficult message, right? It's far from over, but it's begun well. And I think that what's exciting to me is, you had something here. This is now getting to the excitement of being at the Kennedy School. You have the councilman who comes into an executive education program having intersected the problem stream and the politics stream and kind of made something happen and creating that friction, or responding to the friction and creating the policy vehicle. And then you have some students come together, engage with people, and throw out some new ideas, and then engage with people to carry those ideas on. Maybe it can happen anywhere, but I don't know. I think it only happens when you convene people like the people we have working on these teams. So, to the councilmen, to the people in Asheville who have worked with you, to the team, great job. And let's see where this goes to. I think you've both done an incredible job, or both parts of this, in kind of getting this on the road. And let's see where it goes to. I do think the thing that really excites me is that this is not just about Asheville, North Carolina. This is absolutely about something that is a much bigger narrative. And that's why I'm glad that there are other people on this call today who maybe are picking on different parts of that narrative in different places. I do see that Michael Woolcock is on Salimah, and Michael has worked on justice and on these kinds of issues all over the world. And I would love to get a sense from Michael, what do you think about this? You've seen these kinds of social justice projects hatch, grow, mature. You've also seen them not grow, not mature. What do you think what is precarious in the pathway down the line? And I think this is particularly for Keith, because I know that Keith is working on this issue as something close to his heart, close to his mind, and close to his town. So thank you to the team. Thank you to Keith. Thank you to the Kennedy School for allowing me to work with all of you people. And that be the end of me.
Thank you. Michael, that's what happens when you show up to an event. You can be called upon. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was figuring that might happen. I'm mostly just happy to listen. This is so great to just hear and see all this stuff actually happening for someone who spends most of his time calling for it. When you actually get into a headspace and a room space or a virtual space where the people are actually taking this stuff seriously and putting it to the real test, a real test and this, in this particular case, just such a centuries long test, and one it's going to just be so many steps forward and back simultaneously. And so I just want to marvel at what people are doing. I feel very pretentious just sort of floating in and casting my gaze over it all and saying something semi-profound. I just want to bask in the courage and the foresight and the persistence and the willingness to try this, knowing full well that even what victories have been achieved now might still have, are likely to have further challenges ahead, and in Asheville itself, and that others, hopefully inspired by this to try and do something elsewhere, will probably have to go through something like this, like this journey of trying to figure out where these roads around problems and politics and policy all line up. And so just these sort of moments just are ones to just allow yourself to be inspired, and then but inspired not just to have a nice head rush moment, but to be willing to go back into the trenches and figure out what those next steps are like, because it's inherently difficult, it's inherently uncertain, the path is not clear, the resistance is strong, but it's right to do it. And something like PDIA is going to be part of that process. But as we've always said, we need to be PDIAing PDIA. So these kinds of lessons themselves need to inform how we do these things elsewhere, and how we refine our own storylines, how we refine our own strategies. I'm involved with a whole team of people in Cambodia trying to do their own version of all of this right now, virtually. Different kind of challenge, different context, but still a long history of great difficulty around constraining elite power and trying to figure out how to build a common consensus around what to do. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just eager to and enjoying the luxury of just being a participant and just listening. I just want to keep listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. So we will now open for Q&A. Please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. We will take a set of 3 questions at a time. And when you are called, please briefly share your name and your affiliation before asking your question. I will ask that your question be brief and end in a question mark. Feel free to share thoughts, comments in the chat window. That's what we use that for. Thank you.